Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's the fourth of our extended episodes. This one's on the Messianic Secret in Mark's Gospel, and it's a recording of a class that I gave as part of my Introduction to the New Testament in February 2010 here at Duke University. So I hope that doesn't meet with any objections. The Messianic Secret is the most interesting mystery in the New Testament, quite possibly. Certainly the most interesting one in Mark's Gospel. And in a nutshell, I always like to kind of gather up together the most important things right at the beginning, just in case you've slightly lost concentration later on. In a nutshell, it's, why on earth does Jesus keep telling people to shut up? I mean, that's the basic gist of it. And, I mean, I don't know if some of you are still teenagers, I know, but not teenagers of the kind like I've got. Where they say shut up all the time. I mean, I don't know, I don't know whether it's, I'm hoping that they grow out of it eventually, but 14, 15-year-old girls, it seems to me, keep telling one another to shut up, especially if it's their sister. And sometimes Jesus comes across a little bit like that in Mark's Gospel. Something happens, and you're expecting, and then everybody praised God, and they went around and they told everyone the wonderful news of the gospel, and the gospel spread forward, and many, many people were converted. Instead, you get Jesus saying, don't tell anyone what's happened. And you think, what was counterintuitive? What's going on there? It's such a bizarre feature of Mark's gospel that it's gone into notoriety with the film Life of Brian. Now, how many people have actually seen the film Life of Brian? Gosh, only a couple. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'll put on my blog the clip that I want to describe. I nearly brought it along to class today, but I find coping with video clips in class such a stressful business because about 5 times out of 10 they don't work at all. And then I find that the class isn't so much fun because you're dealing the whole time with failed technology. But there's a wonderful, wonderful moment in Life of Brian which is taking the mickey out of this particular element in Mark's Gospel which has not been understood for a couple of thousand years. And what basically happens, the Life of Brian is a Monty Python film all about a chap called Brian who gets mistaken for the Messiah. He's born in the next door stable to Jesus at the beginning of the film. The wise men accidentally visit the wrong stable at the beginning and so on. And Jesus appears in the film only once as an adult, very briefly here, about 2 sentences, and then that's it. And then the rest of it follows this guy, Brian. At the time, in the late 1970s, lots of people thought the film was blasphemous and scurrilous and appalling and all the rest of it. But most of them hadn't seen it, which is usually what happens when people complain about films. And those who had seen it didn't seem to understand that it wasn't actually about Jesus, it was about Brian, who was born in the next door stable, not actually Jesus. So what happens is, in this particular scene is, they're all running after Brian, and Brian stands in front of all these people, and he says, I am not the Messiah. And then there's a moment they're all thinking, oh. And then one bright spark, I think it's John Cleese, he goes, only the true Messiah denies his divinity. And so Brian then says, all right then, I am the Messiah. At which stage everyone goes, he is the Messiah. And they all sort of fall down and worship him. And he goes, well, I can't win. And so off he runs. And so I'll put that little clip on my blog. I'll find the clip for you and stick it on the blog. But that encapsulates the question, what on earth is going on in Mark's Gospel? Now, on the front page of the handout, I've gathered together for you all of the key examples of this secrecy theme. They can be broadly divided up into 4 different categories. The silencing of demons, the silencing of people when they're healed, the parable secret, and the silencing of the disciples. Let's take each one of those 4 in turn so that we understand the problem first. One of my educational philosophies is a really simple one, which is you try and understand the problem before you look for solutions. One of the big mistakes, I think, in my humble opinion, about the way that academic study is often done, especially on the Bible, is people will give you the solution first, and then they'll refract the data through the solution, not giving you the chance independently to assess the problem. And it's true here as it is in other places. So here's the problem first before we look at solutions to the problem. Number 1, the silencing of demons. When Jesus heals people in Mark's Gospel, at the end of the healing, what will often happen is Jesus will tell the person to be quiet, or more accurately, he tells the demon that is inhabiting the person to be quiet. What does Mark usually call demons in his Gospel? He's got a specific, unusual phrase he uses for it. Unclean spirits, yeah. Very, very interesting. And one shouldn't overlook that term, and we'll come back to it, I hope, later on today, because in Mark's Gospel, cleanness and uncleanness is absolutely key. All the way through the Gospel, Jesus is somebody who has something to say about uncleanness and cleanness. And so it's probably not coincidental that he uses this term, unclean spirits. So have a look at a couple of the examples of it. 124, this is Jesus in the synagogue at Capernaum. What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? This is the demoniac who gets up in the synagogue. He says, what do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Be quiet, says Jesus sternly, and come out of him. So Jesus does this exorcism by means of telling the demon to be quiet and to come out of the person. But notice that before the demon comes out of the person, it says, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. It can identify Jesus. That is interesting. Notice again 132 to 133, not long after this incident. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not allow the demons to speak because they knew who he was. I've slightly, in spite of saying that I want to lay out the problem before giving you a solution, I have actually slightly cheated by putting in italics what I regard as something very, very important there. But we'll come back to it. Just mull over that one, and we'll come back to it. And do we want to do any more demon ones? Yes, we want to do one more. 3:11 to 12. Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave strict orders not to tell who he was. Okay, so that's silencing of demons. The second kind, silencing of those who are healed. 143 to 45, that's the healing of the leper. At the end of the story of the healing of the leper is told to tell no one, but he must go and show himself to the priest. Similarly, cast your eyes down to the bottom of the first page, the raising of Jairus' daughter. 543, he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Now, this is a particularly odd example, and it's worth just getting your mind into what's going on here. This story in Mark's Gospel in chapter 5 is of a girl who's 12 years old who is dead. Okay? What happens is Jesus has people come from Jairus, who's the synagogue ruler. They come from Jairus to Jesus and say, my little girl is ill. She's ill and at the point of death. Please come quickly. And then on the way, Jesus heals another woman, a woman who grabs onto his garment, the woman with a hemorrhage. And then after he has healed her, they get to Jairus' house, and when they get there, the girl is already dead. She's died in between the messengers coming and Jesus getting there. And so there are crowds around all morning. Mark even says that there are people there, already the mourners are in playing their instruments, you know, people fluting and wailing and so on. If any of you have been in a culture that celebrates death differently from the way ours do, you might be familiar with this even from the current day. Anyway, so here's the scene. They're all wailing. Jesus says, okay, I'm going to go in and see her. And they're going, it's too late, Jesus, she's dead, she's dead. And he goes, never mind, everybody out, and he clears everybody out of the room except the father and the mother and Peter, James and John. Peter, James and John are always there in Mark's Gospel. I know why as well. Shall I tell you quickly why? Okay. They're there because they're witnessing resurrection. And the thing that Peter, James and John can't understand in Mark's Gospel and the disciples is death and resurrection. So anytime there's anything to do with death and resurrection, they're on the scene. But that's a little extra. That's free. Total free extra. Not part of today's class. So he takes Peter and James and John in, and they do this little thing, and Jesus raises her up from the dead. He says in Aramaic, Talitha kum, little girl, arise. Lovely, Talitha kum, sounds beautiful. So, little girl, arise. And then he says, give us something to eat. And he says, but don't tell anybody what's happened. Now, what I want to know is, right, this guy, Jairus, is the synagogue ruler. He's a public figure that they all know. Imagine the rabbi at a synagogue here in Durham where his daughter has died. Everybody's been there and witnessed it. And then the next Sunday, there she is. You know, hello, you know. I said, oh, I thought you were dead. No, no. I mean, that is how bizarre this story is. How can you tell the parents of a girl that everyone thinks is dead not to tell anybody that she has risen again? This is how odd this theme of secrecy is in Mark's Gospel, and we'll come back to that specific example in a little bit. Third kind of example, there's one more of those, it's the healing of blind Bartimaeus in chapter 10 over the page, but the next example of secrecy is the parable secret, which comes in Mark chapter 4. I've put this on the handout as well, 4:10. When he was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. He told them, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may ever be seeing but never perceiving, ever hearing but never understanding, otherwise they might turn and be forgiven. It looks like what's being said here is that Jesus speaks in parables in order that people in the outside world can't understand what he's saying. He explains everything to his disciples on the inside, the inner group, they get it explained to them. But those on the outside, they don't get to understand what Jesus is talking about. So again, it seems to be some kind of setting up of a secret that isn't open to the outer circles. Again, very, very strange. To many people who are familiar with the gospel story, the Christian story, or who think they are, a lot of this material appears quite counterintuitive. It gets preached on in churches much less than things like John's Gospel, where Jesus stands up and boldly proclaims, I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. You'll hear many, many more sermons on that than you will on don't tell anybody. And this is even more interesting in 4:10 to 12, because he seems to be saying, I'm deliberately concealing things from people lest they turn and be forgiven. Wouldn't you have thought that Jesus is trying to get people to repent and be forgiven, right? You'd have thought so if you have any familiarity with the Christian story. And this is how enigmatic and bizarre this feature is in Mark's Gospel. And then there's a fourth kind of example of secrecy, and it's the secrecy with the disciples. And this is one that some of you, possibly even a lot of you, will be familiar with because of your midterm, and it's the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi. There's a lovely little video, which I'll again put up on my blog, done by University of Nottingham in the UK, of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi, apparently, I've not been. Has anyone here been to Caesarea Philippi? Excellent. Is it all rocky in real life? And because on this video, it shows all this kind of rocky frontage and everything, and says, this is the place where Peter is called the rock by Jesus. And so it's kind of, you know, Jesus is seeing all the rock, and then he christens Peter as the rock, which is a nice little touch, isn't it? But in Mark's Gospel, you get the confession by Peter that Jesus is the Christ. He says, who do people say that I am? And Peter says, some people say John the Baptist, some people say Elijah, some people say one of the prophets. But you, who do you say I am? You are the Christ. And then Jesus goes on to explain what's going to happen to him. And when Peter says, you know, may this never happen to you, he gets strongly rebuked by Jesus. And this really, in a way, is the heart of the whole Messianic Secret theme, because Peter is told not to tell anyone that Jesus is the Christ, and also he fails to understand about the suffering that's going on there. And lots of people will tell you, and I've never done the count to see if this is true or not, that this is the middle verse of Mark's Gospel. That if you take from 16:8 or wherever to 1:1 and try and get the middle verse, it comes to Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi. It may not be true, who cares? It's roughly right, it's roughly in the middle of the Gospel. And I do think the whole Gospel pivots around this moment. So again, why does Jesus tell Peter not to tell anyone that he's the Messiah? What's going on there? Strange, isn't it? Do you know Messiah figures in history usually do tell people that they're the Messiah? They're usually quite proud of being the Messiah. I agree, I don't. I think what you're putting your finger on is the very enigma of why on earth this is going on in the gospel. Why is it that the evangelist Mark, when he's doing this, depicts things in this way? And specifically your point, when we were looking at form criticism and so on, there was this guy Birger Gerhardsson. You remember our friend Birger Gerhardsson, or Birger Gerhardsson? He thought, and it's been quite an influential view, that Jesus must have taught his disciples certain things so that they could remember them and spread them in the oral tradition and all the rest of it. If that's the case, what's going on here? Why is Jesus telling his disciples all the time not to tell anyone? Is it a time-locked thing? Is it just that there's a period of not telling anyone and then afterwards you can? Well, all interesting questions. So how do we explain this phenomenon? What I'm going to do is I think we'll do 2 on the handout, and then we'll take our 5-minute break. That's okay? Now, the most common way of explaining these elements of secrecy in Mark's Gospel is what I would describe as a historical Jesus explanation. In other words, an explanation that tries to understand it in terms of Jesus' own ministry, his relationship with his disciples, and certain realities in first-century Judaism. So, people will say, for example, that it's not surprising that Jesus tells the demons to be quiet, because it's a common feature in exorcism that you tell the person to shut up. If you in an exorcism are trying to get the upper hand, if you're trying to say who's boss, you tell the person to shut up so that you can then sort the demon out. And so one of the things that a lot of historical Jesus scholars have done is they've shown quite persuasively that it is a feature in other exorcisms to tell the thing to be quiet, right? In which case, this isn't anything particularly bizarre or unusual, it's just a standard feature of the way that exorcism is done. That's one really key thing that you get in historical Jesus explanations. Another very common explanation, I'm just going to throw these out. Another common explanation that you get is that Jesus was trying to avoid undue publicity. That the danger is, if as a Messiah figure you're wanting to kind of bring up a group of people and give them sort of teachings and wait until the time is right, until you're ready to go to Jerusalem and so on, maybe the thing to do is you avoid too much publicity. And one way of avoiding too much publicity is by just closing down things whenever you can. Avoid that oxygen of extra and extra and extra publicity and keep on closing it down. Another related explanation is that Jesus simply disliked the standard ways that people thought of messiahs. This is something which I think I must have heard in church settings and in TV documentaries and in popular explanations of Christianity so many times that I almost believe it. But the problem is there's no evidence for it. But I said I was going to just throw them out without a comment. But it's this one. Some of you will have heard this. Don't worry if you haven't heard it before. I'm just prefacing this because I know that some of you will have heard this in popular stuff on Christianity. And it's that Jesus was not going to be the kind of Messiah that Jews of his day were expecting. Jews of his days were expecting a warrior Messiah, someone who was going to come and liberate them from the Romans. Jesus comes along and he thinks, I'm not going to do that. I'm not that kind of Messiah. The kind of Messiah I am is a suffering Messiah. I'm going to die for people's sins and rise from the dead. And therefore, I need to close down any expectations that I'm that kind of warrior Messiah that all these Jews are expecting. And so whenever Jesus tells people to be quiet, he's deliberately trying to stifle, close down, to muffle any expectations that he is that warrior Messiah. He is that big kind of, I'm going to come and liberate you from the Romans type. I still feel, in spite of the evidence, that there's something in this, because when you're a child, if you've had some of this stuff deeply kind of ingrained in your consciousness, it's quite difficult to unlearn it. But one of my formative experiences was as a child watching a British, it's kind of a TV film series. It's actually about 6 hours long, called Jesus of Nazareth. It was made in 1977. J. Franco Zeffirelli. In many respects, it's one of the greatest of the Jesus films, even though Jesus is rather an oddly kind of ethereal, docetic kind of figure, played by Robert Powell, who never blinks. That's how he acted the part. He had these beautiful blue eyes, stunning blue eyes, and he decided that his way of acting as Jesus and differentiating himself from everybody else was never to blink. So you never see him blink on screen. It looks really, really bizarre. I always knew there was something wrong with his portrayal, and I couldn't work out what it was until I heard him explaining this in an interview about 5 or 6 years ago, and I thought, that's it. And I went back and rewatched it. I thought, yes, it's because he goes around like this, you know. But in that film, it's based around the whole idea that Jews were expecting a warrior Messiah, and Jesus comes along and he's not the warrior Messiah, and tries to explain to people that he's not the warrior Messiah. And so the Messianic Secret element is him trying to close down those sorts of expectations and re-educate the disciples about it. I mean, in Jesus of Nazareth, it begins... Right. Excellent. As usual, somebody has got to one of the problems with it, yes. I mean, the point there was, if that was the role, wouldn't Jesus have just said, look, yes, I am the Messiah, but not that kind of Messiah that you've all been expecting, the warrior Messiah. I'm actually a gentle, peace-loving, hippie type of Messiah. Kind of a new kind of Messiah for the new millennium, you know. It could be like, yes, it could. You kind of expect that rather than just, when Peter says, you know, you are the Christ. No, don't tell anybody. You know, I mean, it's not... You know, you are the big warrior Messiah. No, don't tell anyone I'm a warrior Messiah. Tell them I'm a new hippie kind of Messiah. I mean, it's not... Yeah, you're right. Yes, that is one of the real problems with it. In Jesus of Nazareth, it's embedded into it because in the very first episode, which is in 4 parts if you watch it episodically, which is the birth narratives, and it has this wonderful scene where there's a guy in Nazareth on his knees after Rome has just been through pillaging and destroying Galilee. He's on his knees going, Lord, save us, save us. When will you save us? When will you save us from this great oppression from Rome? And then at that moment, it's a brilliant scene, fantastic dramatic irony. At that moment, the angel Gabriel comes and speaks to Mary and promises the son of David to come. And so what it does kind of brilliantly is it juxtaposes what it regards as the Jewish expectation at the time with what the Gospels say about the Messiah coming. But that view is such a common one that I can guarantee that even after this course, lots of you will still hold that view because it is so deeply ingrained in the way that people understand Christianity. There are actually, I think, quite a lot of things wrong with it. And this isn't just me, this isn't just like the Q stuff, that's mainly me, right? You know, this stuff, it's not just me, it's lots and lots of New Testament scholars. It's not, and like a lot of views that are kind of a little difficult to shift, there's actually some truth in it. There's enough truth in it for it to kind of stick. In other words, you can find some stuff in some Jewish texts that do talk about a Messiah who will come in a kind of militaristic way. But the thing is, that's simply because, in a nutshell, and this is to summarize lots and lots of research into about one sentence, but in a nutshell, that's because they're expecting a new Davidic king, and one of the roles of David was, and as a king, was as a kind of military person. So there is that kind of element there in the texts, but the idea that somehow every Jew was expecting that exact kind of Messiah to save them from the Romans, and then Jesus came along and said, no, I'm not that sort of Messiah. As a paradigm, there's too much problematic with it for that to provide the answer to the problem, especially as it really is providing an answer not specifically to this problem of why did Jesus tell people to be quiet, especially as a lot of the commands to silence aren't actually connected with Messiahship as well, are they? Like the sort of Jairus' daughter thing. You know, there's nothing to say, oh, I'm not the kind of Messiah who, and then goes and heals Jairus' daughter. Yeah, I think that'll do for 2 historical Jesus explanations. So let's have our 5-minute break, and then we'll look at the other kind of explanations and what's right and what's wrong about them. Okay, so there's some historical Jesus explanations that try to understand the feature as it appears in Jesus' own ministry. But the thing is, even if all of those elements that we looked at are historical, even if all of those are things that happen in Jesus' ministry, you still have to say, why is it that Mark chooses to stress these things? And it's why I always get a little bit dissatisfied when scholars will sometimes say, perhaps it just happened. Well, perhaps it did. But the question isn't, did it happen or not? The question is, why did Mark choose to mention these particular things and make such a big deal of them? So, you remember what last time, on last Wednesday, when we did redaction criticism, I said that there are several ways that you can do redaction criticism of Mark. One of the things is to look for repeated motifs in the gospel. Another way to do it is to look at things happening at key structural moments. Now, both of those things are true for the secrecy theme. First of all, it's repeated. You get it again and again and again in Mark's Gospel, as we've seen. And second, you see it at key structural moments, especially that one at the end of chapter 8 when Jesus tells Peter not to tell anyone that he's the Christ. Also, it appears in lots of different kinds of material, which also would seem to suggest that it's something the redactor is wanting to bring through. Notice that it doesn't just happen in Jesus' speech, but also something the narrator himself adds. And if you contrast Matthew and Luke, there's much less secrecy, and in John's Gospel there's almost none at all. John's Gospel actually has its own version of the Messianic Secret, which is slightly different, but we'll come to that in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. It's not quite the same, but it borrows something of the ethos of it. Very, very exciting. We'll come to that in due course. John's great. Well, after you've spent weeks on the synoptics, and then you get to John, it's like, wow, this is really, really different. So we look forward to that. The secrecy motif is therefore an invitation to do redaction criticism of Mark. It's something that just makes you, as an interpreter, say, why? Why does Mark, why does the redactor, why does the evangelist make so much of this particular theme? And here there was a pioneer, a character called William Vader, a German, always Germans in this period of scholarship. And he is the one that coined the term the Messianic Secret. He wrote a book on it in 1901, and it wasn't translated into English until 1971. It took the Brits and the Americans 70 years to realise how important it was. Actually, they all knew, and they all referred to it in German. And then eventually someone says, we better translate it then, and it's now, you can actually read the thing in English. But Vader said, and he didn't know anything about redaction criticism, because this is like 50 years before redaction criticism. So in a way, he was a kind of a pioneer of redaction criticism without even realising what he was doing. And what Vader said is that this motif is actually one of the most striking things in the early Christian tradition. And he thought it told us something very important about Mark and very important about the historical Jesus. He said, could it be that Jesus himself never claimed to be the Messiah? He himself didn't go around doing messianic kind of things. But the disciples and people after his resurrection decided that he was the Messiah and said, oh my goodness, this is the Messiah. Now he's died and he's risen again. Oh, it was the Messiah. And then, in trying to reflect on all of that non-messianic material that you've got in the tradition swirling around, Vader thinks the disciples said, how on earth can we explain all of that non-messianic stuff? How can we explain the fact that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah? And so it's not quite an equation, but I've done a sort of summary of how Vaders saw this develop about midway down the handout into number 4. You have non-messianic, this is the way Vaders saw it, you have non-messianic traditions about Jesus. When you combine those with the conviction that Jesus was the Messiah, what you can do is get the secrecy motif to kind of blend those two things together, to explain how it was that Jesus knew he was the Messiah, but nobody else did. So for Vaders, Mark, or more accurately for Vaders, it was the people before Mark, this sort of oral tradition before Mark, they tried to find a literary motif or a kind of theological motif that would explain what they saw as this great anomaly, that Jesus, as far as they were concerned, was the Messiah, and yet had never claimed to be. It's that he knew full well he was the Messiah, but just kept it secret. And that's what Vaders thought was going on in Mark's Gospel. And he says, you remember we talked a bit about Jairus' daughter? He says, the very fact that it's so absurd to tell someone to be quiet when their daughter's just been raised from the dead shows that this is an artificial figure. This is an artificial literary motif. It's not something that happened historically. So similarly, when you get in chapter 10, the healing of blind Bartimaeus, it's all the people on the road that tell Bartimaeus to be quiet. He's going, Son of David, have mercy on me. And all the people on the road are saying, be quiet, shut up, like this kind of thing. And Vaders said, that shows that it's a kind of artificial literary motif, because why would the crowds be telling people to shut up about him being Son of David? So Vaders thought that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, never claimed to be the Messiah, but that the early Christians who came to believe that he was the Messiah after the resurrection superimposed that belief on these non-messianic traditions. And their only way of doing that was through the secrecy motif. And the reason that this is so important is that if Vaders' right, it's, if you like, the thing that gives birth, it's the catalyst that kind of leads to Mark's Gospel. Because it's the first attempt to make sense of Jesus' life as the Messiah, in spite of the fact for Vaders that he didn't claim to be the Messiah. Now, Vaders' key verse, he doesn't just kind of invent all this out of thin air. His key verse is Mark 9, verse 9. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. And this is how Vaders thought that the motif worked, that the disciples in real life kind of only realized this stuff after the resurrection. They only thought after the resurrection, oh my goodness, it was the Messiah. And then they kind of superimposed that understanding on all the earlier material. And Vaders used, as a means of kind of backing this up, a couple of other early texts which seem to suggest that messiahship was connected with Jesus' resurrection, that people only came to think of him as Messiah at the resurrection. Look at Romans 1:3, which Paul wrote. He's declared with power to be Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. And so Vaders would take verses like that and say that that was why the disciples thought that Jesus was the Messiah. That's Vaders. Are you persuaded? It's a good radical thesis, isn't it? Okay, I'm going to tell you what's wrong with it and what's right with it, in my humble opinion. Do you know, have you ever heard those stories, legends about Darwin on his deathbed recanting the whole theory of evolution? Yeah? There's exactly the same story about Vaders. A lot of conservative apologists will tell you that Vaders on his deathbed recanted his Messianic Secret theory. And I've never been able to get to the bottom of this. I suspect it's one of those kind of myths that, in any case, even if he did, quite often people aren't in their best intellectual state on their deathbed anyway, are they? You know. But anyway, but that's one of the things I've heard repeated, that Vaders recanted this whole theory on his deathbed. And then it's given us an excuse for people not to worry about this theory. But more seriously, there are definitely some things wrong with Vaders' thesis. One of them is that it is very difficult to make sense of the Gospels if Jesus had no kind of messianic idea or consciousness at all. It seems very odd that he would not think of himself in any way as possibly being an anointed person of God. And more importantly, it's bizarre to think that no one else thought of him in this way during his lifetime. One of the most certain things about Jesus that we know is that he was crucified as some kind of brigand, as some kind of insurrectionist, as some kind of, the word in Greek is leistes, which I've put on the handout. If Jesus was crucified as some kind of insurrectionist kind of figure, as Romans saw it, then the odds are that he was perceived by those who were around him to be some kind of messianic claimant. If Jesus was crucified with that kind of perception around, it's difficult to imagine that there was completely no messianic claim at all in the body of the Gospels. So Vaders rather stark, Jesus didn't think he was the Messiah kind of approach, maybe a little bit too strong. All the more so as there are other stories in the Gospels which some people regard as being authentic, like Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on a donkey, which looks like a kind of messianic claim, some kind of attempt to fulfill a prophecy in Zechariah. So it's thought by many people that Vaders' thesis falters on the fact that Jesus actually did think of himself in some sense as Messiah. And what's more, that people around him thought of him as, in some sense, Messiah. The other problem that Vader didn't really pay serious attention to is that there are such key exceptions to the rules in Mark's Gospel. So it isn't consistently the case that Jesus tells people to be quiet. In 5:19-20, in this story of the Gerasene demoniac, Jesus actually goes and tells the Gerasene demoniac to go and preach. Go and tell them what the Lord has done for you, is what Jesus says. Very odd. Suddenly, you get this, yeah, you can go and preach. Mm-hmm.
Some people call that editorial fatigue.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, the other explanation which tends to be given is that the Gerasene demoniac is in Gentile territory. He's gone over the river. So it could be that the Messianic Secret or the secrecy theme is for Israel, but for Gentiles it's okay for them to preach. It could be that. Or it could be just that Mark's just, didn't think about it. As I think we've touched on this point before, but they would all have been fairly horrified by the thought 2,000 years later we're still all dissecting their work, right? So that's what's wrong with Vader. But I don't want to get into this kind of Vader bashing, because if you read a lot of books on the New Testament and on Mark's Gospel, they will just try and dispense with Vader quite quickly. And I think it's a mistake to do it, because I think Vader had seen something of real importance as a motif in Mark's Gospel. And I think this just sort of easy dismissal of Vader actually does miss that this is key in Mark's Gospel. And one of my own personal complaints about the way that the Messianic Secret is studied still in New Testament scholarship is all too often it's studied as a problem in the historical Jesus rather than an issue in Mark's Gospel. Because as I've said already, Mark could have chosen not to include this material. So even if some of these things happened historically, Mark could have chosen not to include them. So I think he got important things right. It's the first successful exercise in redaction criticism, by which I mean that he was looking carefully at literary emphases in the Gospel. It appreciates the importance of the Gospels as books of propaganda, because what Vader thought the Gospels were doing, or at least Mark's Gospel was doing, was it was constructing a Gospel of Jesus the Messiah. And in order to construct a Gospel, good news, propaganda of Jesus the Messiah, what he had to do was find a way of explaining how Jesus was Messiah. So there's something in what Vader is doing that draws attention to Mark as a Gospel, as a piece of propaganda. And we dealt with this when we looked at what are the Gospels, but I'm just reminding you here as well that Gospel is Godspell, is good news, is evangelion. Propaganda, written to persuade people that Jesus is the Christ. And Vader could see that. And I think sometimes when historical Jesus scholars try so hard to understand the thing as a bit of historical Jesus stuff. They're not paying serious attention to the gospel as propaganda, as attempting to persuade people of what it believes Jesus is all about. And it's an exercise in the historical critical approach, suspicious of the text, not taking events narrated at face value. And I like that. I like the way that this particular approach acts fundamentally in a suspicious way about the text, which I think is always a good mark of critical historical scholarship. So the most successful explanations of this feature are those ones that look at it as a literary motif. But how do we explain it? Well, I must admit, this is one of these things where I don't think I've fully got it, but I think I can get bits of it. So let me just tell you some of the bits of it that I think are going on here. There's one element in it which I think is really clear, and that's that Mark is a kind of cosmic drama. It's not just a straightforward description or narration of the way that people were interacting with Jesus and with one another. It's really like a cosmic drama. And some of the key actors in the drama aren't walking around on the earth in Galilee or in Jerusalem or anywhere else. They're actually in heaven or in hell or wherever else. And therefore, you have the actors that are around on the stage often not having any clue who Jesus is, whereas the supernatural figures, the cosmic figures, know full well who Jesus is. And it leads to a fantastic two-level drama. So right from the beginning, you remember one of the very first examples of this secrecy element comes in 124 in the synagogue in Capernaum. We hardly even know who Jesus is yet. We've had the baptism where it's been announced that he's the Messiah. Well, it's been announced he's Son of God, actually, but you've had that announced in chapter 1. And then just later on in the same chapter, you think, gosh, what's going to happen next? And he gets into the synagogue, and this demon starts saying, oh my goodness, I know who you are, you're the Holy One of God. And as the reader, you're thinking, gosh, all the supernatural figures know who Jesus is. God's told everybody, or told the readers anyway, at the baptism. Now the demons seem to know who Jesus is, and meanwhile, all the participants in the actual drama are going around going, I don't know who he is, who is it? And it's a brilliant piece of dramatic irony. But it's not just dramatic irony in the sense that we use it now in our own contemporary fiction. I mean, in contemporary fiction, dramatic irony works by revealing things to the audience that the actors in the drama don't know themselves, right? And a lot of the drama comes from the fact that you know stuff that they don't know, and you think, oh no, if only you knew that really he loves you, and it's, you know, it's all a misunderstanding. I mean, that's really how it works, isn't it, that kind of thing? I tell you one of the things I really hate. It's the reverse motif, where the actors in the drama know more than we know. I went on Saturday to see a film called Valentine's Day with my girls. And I say my girls, I mean that's like my daughters. I mean, sorry, I just heard how that sounded, didn't it? I went to see a film with my girl, with the daughters, right? So I went to see this film, and I'm not going to spoil the ending, but there's several endings in the film where it turns out that the filmmakers have held back information from the viewer. And so the dramatic denouement depends on the fact that they haven't told you some key information. And that's the case, well, you know, I couldn't have get, you know. And the thing is, if it's a whodunit, that's all right. But in a romantic comedy, I don't think that's on. I like romantic comedies that use dramatic irony, so that you're thinking, no, he really does love you, or she really does love him, and it was only a little mistake, you know. So it's got that in it as well, because there's so many plots in Valentine's Day. Anyone else seen it? Yeah. What do you think? It's no Love. It's what it's trying to be is Love Actually, but it's not. It's not as good as that. And that's not just British bias. I just think Love Actually is a better film. Okay, so that's kind of dramatic irony. Now, but in Mark's Gospel, it's not just dramatic irony. It's cosmic dramatic irony. So you get to find out who Jesus is by listening to God and the demons, the supernatural people in the drama. And I think that that's certainly a large element in what's going on in this Messianic Secret thing. It may be that Mark has slightly over-egged it, that he didn't quite mean to get so into the sort of don't tell anyone, don't tell anyone. And then what we're really supposed to be paying attention to is the cosmic element. But I think that's a large part of it, that it's almost like the heavens are trying, almost the heavens are kind of breaking. Literally, at the beginning of the gospel, they're torn open with this announcement of who Jesus is. And then all the actors in the drama are going, I don't know who he is. Who is he? I don't know. Do you know who he is? You know, and it's kind of adds to it because the angels, the demons, and God know, but the disciples don't. So that's a large part of it. The other side of it that I think must be involved here, and this is the bit that I want to develop a little bit more on Wednesday when we look at the related thing of the incomprehension of the disciples. And it's that Mark is a gospel of Christ crucified. One of the earliest Christian confessions goes right back as early as we can get. 1 Corinthians 15, 1-3. Paul, when he's talking to the church in Corinth, says this is something that he has received from those who are Christians before him. He's passing it on to the church in Corinth as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Christ died. It's very, very early, important nugget. And I think that Mark's Gospel can actually be seen as being structured around those two words, Christ crucified. The first half of Mark's Gospel, all the way up to Peter's confession, deals with Jesus as the Christ. So it culminates in Peter having come to realize that Jesus is the Christ. The second half of the Gospel is all about the march towards crucifixion, the way of the Lord leading towards crucifixion. And therefore it may be that what Mark is trying to do in his Gospel is show how this person that people called Christ came to be crucified. Because another interesting thing that Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians is that this idea of a Messiah being crucified was a stumbling block to Jews. In Greek, a skandalon to Jews. So it could be that what's going on for Mark is he's trying to explain how it can be that the Messiah came to be crucified. And one element in that is to keep the business about Jesus as Messiah, if you like, keep it kind of under wraps until you get right to the culmination of the gospel. Because eventually in the gospel, Jesus does confess to being Messiah. In chapter 14, he's standing in front of the high priest, and the high priest says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And what does Jesus say? "I am." So you see, Jesus does make confession at the end of the gospel. And this was something that Vaders just thought this was just a kind of a little bit of made-up stuff at the end of the gospel, that Jesus must in the end have kind of come good, and Mark's got to kind of do that. But for Mark, what's happening is, as soon as Jesus actually confesses in public to being the Messiah, what happens? He dies. He's crucified. So Mark is trying to show the reader that there is an implicit link between the Christ and crucifixion, which is a scandalon to many of his Jewish readers. So that Mark is, in a sense, an attempt to explain how it can be that the Messiah was crucified. And one way of doing that is by saying this business of him being the Messiah didn't come out in public till right at the end, and as soon as it came out in public, he was killed. So that could be also something to do with the whole Messianic secret. Any questions about this topic? Okay, well what we'll do is we'll expand it a little further on Wednesday by looking at the broader issue of why it is the disciples never know what Jesus is talking about.
Well, thanks for listening along to this latest extended episode of the NT Pod. I hope there'll be another one of these along at some point in the future. You can find everything related to the NT Pod on the website at podacre, that's podacre.blogspot.com. You can find me on Duke University's iTunes U, or just an iTunes U. You can Google for the NT Pod, or you can look for me on Twitter at Goodacre. Thanks again for listening, and look forward to being with you again soon.